Perfect.
Thank you so much for your time. And this time we're going to talk about crusades. I'd like to ask you, have you been to Jordan and this part of Levant when you studied crusades as a military phenomena, historical phenomena? Because in Jordan we have three important fortresses: Karak, Ajun, and Montreal or Shobak. Although we have another stronghold in Petra.
Yeah,
Yes, go ahead.
yeah, sorry. So I've been in Jordan and Syria just before the civil war, though I was still a teenager at that point. I already had an interest in the region and studying that period. And I've been visiting a certain number of sites, including Karak, including Petra, and the medieval remains of Petra as well. So yeah, I've been in Jordan. Sadly, since I began my PhD, I've not been able to do this, mainly because of COVID. And I was planning quite an important field trip, not in Jordan itself. I was planning to go more in Lebanon, which I've not visited so far. And as well, maybe after the PhD, when I'll be done with that, I hope to be able to make a field trip in southern Turkey and northern Iraq, um, in order to verify, because I might have with satellites and pictures, I might have located a fortress or two that were not located by former historians. So I have good hope that the remains I've been identifying might have been castles I was looking for. So that will be the priorities. But I would love to go back to Jordan. To be fair, Karak was really probably the castle, my favorite castle of all. Even if I've seen huge castles like the Chevalier in Syria, I've always, I think Kerak have always been my favorite for uh, the look of the surroundings, the castle itself, that is very impressive as well, and the underground section of it that are just amazing.
I almost broke my back when I went to underground section in 2017, because you have all kinds of secret passages, and they didn't tell me in advance that we're going to have a tour from one of these passages located near the gas station underneath the fortress. So I was very naive and came dressed up for unofficial lecture at Mota University, and I almost got into trouble when I went to one of these secret passages and hideouts that they used to bring water and food for besieged city. And your interest is the relationship between besieged cities and people who put the city under the siege. So how complex is the relationship between two parties?
So that's very complex because I've not only studied crusading warfare, but I've also studied warfare between Muslim principalities as well. Um, so it is very different if you look at how Muslims besiege themselves, and how, for instance, Muslims besieged Franks or Franks besieged Muslims themselves. So you have differences in that. However, it's not as different as it could seem to be. You would expect, for instance, war against the Crusaders to be much more violent, but it wasn't always the case. I always remember the example of Zonki when attacking Baalbek and making a promise to the governor that the city and himself would be protected if they surrender, and breaking his promise and enslaving and slaughtering a lot of people in the city. So it wasn't just between Franks, it was more the overall kind of war in that period that tended to be quite violent. If we take about relationship, the main thing is when we analyze, for instance, a siege, if we take the siege of Antioch during the First Crusade, if you look, you have Turkish commanders in the garrison, and you have crusaders who attack them. However, when you look a bit closer, you notice that most of the garrison is composed of Oriental Christians. Because Antioch was a population that we know pretty well to have been with a majority of Christians and a minority of Muslims. If you go to Aleppo at the same period, you have a very important Sunni community, but you also have an important Shia community in Aleppo, and that will cause quite a lot of political trouble for the city in the first 20 years of the Crusades, especially at the very beginning under Ridwan, when, well, the Ismaili will try to take over the city multiple times or to influence Ridwan quite a lot, and causing a lot of fitna so a lot of sort of civil disorder in the city itself. You have cities like Jerusalem, when the Crusaders arrived, which had a lot of different minorities. You had Muslim inhabitants, you had Oriental Christians, you had Jews. But when the Crusaders arrived, they had so little men, and they cleaned, and that's really Adrian Boas's words, an ethnical cleaning of the city. After that, they tried to keep only Christians in the city for quite a while. But by the end of the period I'm studying, so by the end of the 12th century, just before Saladin come back in and took the city, Jews has been allowed back in the city. Muslims were allowed to go in the city, but not to stay at night. And so a lot of cities had minorities, different minorities, that were often different from the rulers. The rulers were mainly either a Frankish or European elite or a Turkish elite ruling over Levantine Arabs, and not ruling over Turks. So every commander had to really think about how they would rule them. And if it might have been problematic in some periods, it seems that it wasn't really problematic in most of the cases, as long as taxes and trade were continuing, people were okay with having different people as governors. And I suppose it is due to the history of the region that have been disputed between so many different belligerents over centuries, that inhabitants understood that their best interest was just to keep their life and to continue to try to enrich and to try to use newcomers to become richer if they could. And on that regard, there is a testimony that is very interesting from Ibn Jubayr. In 1184, he's doing a travel, he's doing the Hajj to Mecca, and then he's continuing to Baghdad, to Mosul. He goes then to Aleppo, Damascus, and finally go into the Kingdom of Jerusalem to take his ship back to Spain. And when he crossed the border between Damascus and the Kingdom of Jerusalem, he is very surprised that regarding taxes, Muslims in the Christian territory have more advantages than on the other side of the border and Muslim domination, because they pay less tax on agricultural production, which is very interesting. And he's surprised. You can see in his writing that he's surprised that they are pretty well treated in terms of taxes. Obviously, they had different duties. They had taxes because they were Muslims. Just as Christians had taxes because they were Christians in Muslim lands. So it's the same kind of thing, but taxes were considered reasonable by him, and it is not that much of a biased opinion because he's neither belonging to any Frankish dominated land and he's not belonging to the Ayyubid Sultanate either. So he is really sort of a foreigner from Muslim confession that discover a situation. And obviously, if we speak about exchanges, he is traveling with a caravan, with merchants. And this caravan is going from Baghdad to following the main roads, the main trade routes of the time, so which is Baghdad, Mosul, Aleppo, Damascus, and then split in two roads, one going in the Kingdom of Jerusalem to Acre or to Tripoli and Tyre, depending on where they go, but to one of the main ports of the kingdom, or to Egypt, using the Sinai and then going to Alexandria or Cairo. So you can see that trade continued, and trade continued even in wartime, which shows that exchanges and war were part of their life. So, for instance, in 1184, when he's crossing and going in the Kingdom of Jerusalem, well, just a few months ago, Saladin had besieged Herat.
Yeah.
So, yeah, you have that kind of exchanges that are commercial, and you also have cultural exchanges. For instance, we know pretty well that Europeans, when they arrived, after 10 or 15 years, had completely changed their way to dress. They were using silk clothes. They were eating differently as well, eating more fruits, eating in an Oriental way, much more than the European ways. So they adopted part of the culture. You also have a lot of weddings between Oriental Christians and European Christians that settled there, which shows that they really went into trying to understand the other. And on the other side, Muslims also adapted. You see, for instance, at Shaza in the Orontes Valley, Usama ibn Mungib, his family was, for instance, going to Easter to just see how Christians were doing it.
Yeah.
So you had a lot of cultural exchanges, a lot of curiosity, I would say, between the two worlds.
When you mentioned Karak and Christian population, until the Ottoman conquest in 1517 and during 16th century, the population of Karak itself was predominantly Christian. The area around Karak, of course, was a different story, so villages were predominantly Muslim. Was crusade, in a way, a turning point for the relations between local Muslims and Orthodox Christians who lived in the Levant? Not only Orthodox Christians, because we have other sects. Let's call them Eastern Christian churches. Because we know that the number of Christians after Crusade started to shrink, although Muslims became the majority of Levant in 8th, 9th century. So way before Crusades.
Yeah, so on the regard of population, if we take Eastern Christians, we can see, for instance, that Armenians church, the Armenian church and Armenians in general, didn't change that much during the Crusades. They were interacting between Byzantines and Muslims for quite a while and having a sort of semi-autonomous principalities, they were ready to accept the leader that was coming to them and just endure. The only difference is probably they became more autonomous, especially in Cilicia, that they were before the Crusades arrived. However, then it continued after the Crusades, especially with Mongols. They continued, they allied themselves to Mongols to continue to have that sort of autonomy, even if it was in theory belonging to either the Mongols or before that to the Seljukids. They were in fact autonomous because these powers had no way to really rule over these lands. And they were pretty satisfied not to have to do it and to focus on other fights. So for Armenians, the question is probably they didn't change that much. And when we see, for instance, when Zonki and then Nur ad-Din took Edessa, Armenians had their way in both things. What led to the massacre of them, of a large part of them by Nur ad-Din, is because they rebelled against him. And that's not linked to being an ethnical or a religious minority. It leads to you've rebelled against your lord. So that would be for Armenians. Greek, so the Orthodox, probably had more changes because they were always kind of reluctant to the Crusaders themselves. Quite a lot of their positions were taken by Catholics, and so they were semi-hostile to them, but they still try to make their play with the Crusaders. I think it's probably the church that was the most distant with the Crusaders when they arrived, and that were probably sort of winners of the Muslim reconquest because they were able to take back the seats they have been losing under the Crusaders. Even if it doesn't mean they were more powerful, it's more coming back to the situation of pre-Crusade Levant. If we take other churches like Syriac, so more in the southern parts, what is actually Palestine or Jordan, which you had much more Syriac populations, then I think their situation doesn't change too much either, because it was under Muslim governors or under Frankish governors, they were treated about the same. They might have had a more important presence in Jerusalem itself than before, but I'm not an expert of obviously inhabitants in Jerusalem. But from what I've been reading, I think they had a slightly better situation during the Crusades than before, but they were able to keep it afterwards pretty well, apart from Jerusalem, in which a lot of people had to exile when Saladin took back the city. But it was temporary. They mainly came back in the years after. And that's often the case when a city was besieged. When population was exiled, a few years later, you can find the same population being back in the city. So it tends to be a temporary kind of solution to exile the population, the time to stabilize the conquest, and then the population either come back or settle in the neighborhood. That can be either suburbs of the city, or that can be villages around. Speaking about villages, I think a reason why some minorities were able to stay for that long is because we've spoken about cities, and those cities had people from different minorities. Villages were completely different. You didn't have much villages that had both Muslims and Christians. in general, you had a Muslim village or an Armenian village or a Frankish village, but they didn't mix really. So, for instance, the European settlers came and founded or reoccupied some villages. There were not many in general in a village compared to Islamic villages that had a much more important population, but they occupied different villages. They were not mixing that much in rural areas.
So there's some medieval historians who think that division between confessions that we mentioned wasn't that deep during medieval time. I tend to disagree with that. I think that in modern time, in our time, it's much easier to compromise between different confessions, especially in our secular societies, while in the medieval period, all kinds of dogmatic changes directly reflected on political decisions and state decisions. And most of these divisions were actually created in medieval time, not in modern time. So I tend to think that it's a misconception by some historians who try to minimize, maybe because they are looking at the medieval period from the modern nuances and modern perspective. They think that political correctness existed in 13th century or 12th century.
Yeah, I think on that regard, when, for instance, I spoke about cities having different minorities in them, they're not living together. Uh, Mainly, they're split in different boroughs. And boroughs in the Middle Ages, especially in the 13th century, which is not my period. My period is really the 12th century.
Of course.
We lack evidence for the 12th century, but we have archaeological evidence for the 13th century. In cities like Damascus, for instance, boroughs were clustered. So you had the main streets of the town going basically from the gates from the outside to either the Great Mosque or the Citadel. And between these great streets, you had secondary streets and boroughs. And those boroughs were really clustered. You had one or two streets going into them. They were very easy to close, and often you had gates to close the access to a specific borough. And then streets were more one-way roads more than streets going from a point A to a point B. You had an entrance and you had an exit that was the same. And it was just a dead end for most of the streets. So boroughs were really clustered together. And inhabitants if we take, for instance, an Armenian living in his borough, he'll get to the market of his borough, he'll get to the shops in his borough, he'll probably work in his own borough, but he will very rarely getting out of that borough. He might get to the main streets, but he will very unlikely go in the Muslim borough or in the Orthodox borough. His only reason to go there would be if he had to trade with someone, for instance. But that will be more done on the markets, the important markets of a city. So I think we overestimate sometimes how much population moved and traveled. People in villages were going from their village to the local town to sell their products, but they were not going further. In fact, those traveling were merchants, were caravans or armies, but the other ones were staying. So interaction between them was probably quite limited in that aspect. It's more merchants that they were able to discover Muslim merchants, Frankish merchants, but were they really interacting with the next village? We don't have a lot of evidence for that. So I would partly agree with what you were saying, being like we overestimate sometimes the interactions and the connection. You would not have your neighbor being a Muslim and your other neighbor being an Orthodox. Your neighbors will be from the same community than yours. But then you might talk with the other community. It's just not living with you. So I think that's the first and most frequent misconception when we speak about exchanges between these communities. If it doesn't mean they were not interacting, it's just maybe not an everyday interaction. And religion matters itself. I think if we take Europe at the same time, you have a very segmented population, and religious minorities are quite mistreated. In the Levant, it's a bit different because you had important populations from each. You had to give them more than you were giving in other areas and to let them do more. We know, for instance, that Muslim governors before the Crusade were employing quite a lot of Jewish people in the administration. So you still had these people being employed and having sort of important situation. But things you can find as well is that they were not having the same justice. If you take the case of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, that we know pretty well, if you were belonging to a minority, for instance, if you were Muslim, you had a different court than if you were someone from Europe, or if you were from an Italian Republic merchant. For instance, if you were Venetian, you would have your own court as well in Acre. That will not be the same that for a burgess of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, or that would not be the same than a Muslim. So if you were prosecuted for something, you would have to go to a different court. And when there was a problem between two communities, you were relying on the upper court, which was ruled basically by the kings of Jerusalem, but you had judge from the different communities. So that's probably when things were mixed together. But yeah, communities were living together on their own, and sometimes they were mixing with the others. You had exchanges, but not for everyday life. On that, I do agree with you.
Yeah. What do you think about ethnic division? Because some of our colleagues, historians, think that ethnicity didn't exist before the end of 18th century or before 18th century in general, and there are very brave assumptions that ethnicities and ethnic groups started to form themselves during Enlightenment and during civic revolutions in 18th century. I disagree with that as well. I think that ethnic groups existed long before medieval time, but they had different ways of expressing themselves than in modern time and in modern political time. How these ethnic groups lived side by side, because we have, of course, Seljuk Turks, we had Kurds, we had Arabs, we had Europeans who came as crusades, during crusades, and they de facto ruled these medieval melting pot societies.
Yeah, and to go in your way, I think it's mostly because modern historians, it began before. The perception of Middle Ages at the very beginning, in the name Middle Ages, was invented in the Renaissance, when people are trying to make links to antiquity and being like, well, it's the average period that we don't want to talk about much. And then in the 19th century, way later, historians continued a bit to separate the Middle Ages, which was the period of religion of kings in Europe, compared to ancient era and modern era, in which you have more either democracy or republic, religion is less pregnant, thing like that. But the main thing is, when we talk about interactions, it's obviously the same word, but it doesn't have the same meaning depending on the period you are. And I think the main reason why people imagine a lot of interactions in the modern way is because they don't think about that term for other periods. And a big example of that, if we take Europe, is nowadays Christianism, especially Catholicism, is really a religion. At that time, yes, it was a religion, but it was the society. Either you were part of the society or you were excluded from the society. So you're not religious because you believed. You were religious because it was your society. There was nothing else.
Exactly. If someone tried to differ from the mainstream, he would be completely ostracized by church, by society, by fellow citizens and fellow kinmen. So it was much more significant back then than now, when we have all kinds of religious freedoms and secularism for past 200 years. And so you're right.
Yeah, the main difference probably in the Levant is, as you had multiple societies of different religions, you are probably able to make your choice a bit more than in Europe. However, it's still the same. If you live somewhere, if you live in a borough or in a village, and you don't want to follow what that community is doing, you will have to leave, probably. And it is very unlikely that if you're an Armenian, for instance, converting to Islam when Turks arrived, it's very unlikely you will still live in the same borough. You'll have moves, and that means a lot. That means you lose every resource you have. That means you lose your wealth. So conversion would be very, very important in terms of material changes. In terms as well, you will no longer have your friends and things like that, because you'll have changed your place of living. However, you had more ability to change, obviously, in the Levant than in Europe or in Iraq, in which the population was much more Islamicized than in the Levant. But on that, I do agree. We must not think that societies were like open to other religions and things like that. And you can see that from Usama in Munkit, as I said earlier, in his book, in his kitab, you can see basically all the bad perception he had on Franks, on their way of living, on their women's especially. That doesn't mean he doesn't respect them, because you can see in many examples that he have respect, that he befriended some of them. But we must remember he's a member of the elite.
Yes.
And elites interact much more than common people.
Absolutely.
As
like
well.
Today, like in modern time, in a way. People who are jet set, or people who are political decision makers or military decision makers, are going to interact with each other. They're not going to interact with ordinary people.
Well, some might, but yeah, it's much more segmented at that point. There is, if for instance the Frankish lord is interacting with commoners, it's because he have business to do with them. It's because he is doing justice. It is because he is taking his taxes, or because he has complaints that he needs to assess, things like that. But he will not literally go in a tavern to have a drink with those people.
No.
No, clearly not. And so yeah, I think applying modern thinking on how the society could work is not. We need to understand the medieval society, and the medieval society was a segmented society. a very segmented society in which you tended to know and to interact with people that were like you. And you might have contact with other peoples, but it was more exceptional. A bit less exceptional in the Levant than in other era, but still quite exceptional as well.
I'm going to send you another link and we'll continue our conversation very soon.
Yeah, perfect. You're sending it by email, I suppose.
Yeah, I'm going to send this in a few seconds.
Okay.
Now we can talk about gender roles during crusade and how different genders contributed to the general cause during besieging of cities.
Yeah. So if we look at who did what in sieges, basically you have a few tasks that needed to be done. You had the fighting itself, the defense of the walls, for instance, or the sallies, or the countermining. So all that fighting activity is a few exceptions, though. A few cases in which women occasionally took up arms but it is more in extreme situation. For instance, when places were taken by assault, when the enemy had crossed the walls, and women basically defended themselves from direct attack, direct assault. And they would use either weapons or armors they could find. You have example, for instance, in Shaisa in 1114, where the elite women of the city will distribute weapons to the men, but some of them, two of them, will also wear armors and swords and will actually fight against the Nizari, which were trying to take over the city because the men were out of the city. So they had to defend themselves because they were fearing that they would be enslaved or worse. And some women were ready to like commit suicide, but some were ready to fight. So you had that. In other places, you can see women taking arms as well. For instance, Frankish women in Acre that during the Third Crusade decided to cut throat of Muslim troops after the battle. So you had a few cases of women fighting. You have quite a more important number of cases in which women were governing a place that was besieged. Either Muslim women or Frankish women, you had a few cases. Muslim women tended to be criticized by others when they were taking up the command of a city, either directly by saying they didn't do a good job, or indirectly by saying that the men in the city were weak, and that's why women had to take up the command, especially, for instance, if we look at the Burid dynasty of Damascus. And basically, you see the mother of the prince frequently coming in action in politics to explain that Burid were weak. How much is it accurate? How much it is propaganda from the time? That's difficult to judge, especially when news writing about this are Ibn al-Athir, which was a Zonkid propagandist, or when you take authors like Al-Isfahani or Abu Shama, which were more a Yubid propagandist. So the only one that sometimes presents women as being important in the Burid dynasty, but not as the men being weak, just the women being more used for political matters, is Ibn al-Qalanisi, which was a Burid propagandist. So it's difficult to know how much these are accurate. On the Frankish side, you have much more accurate portraying of women commanding places. And interestingly, in Muslim chronicles, especially during the time of Saladin, well, Frankish commanders that were women tends to be rather praised because they did a good job. Um, so yeah, you have women commanding, um, and then you have another big task, which is logistics, because in a siege it is very good to have fortifications, it is very good to have men, but if you don't have any food, if you don't have any water, if you don't have any weapons, you can't defend yourself. So logistics is an important part that have been pretty badly studied, to be fair, so far. If you take very recent studies, if you take Michael Fulton, book about siege warfare during the Crusades, he's the one that spoke the most about logistics, and he writes 3 pages about them. So it's very reduced focus. If we take a French historian, Alain Tamy, which had done a PhD, which is not published, he's focusing a bit more on logistics, but it's still about 4 or 5 pages out of 500. So it tends to be something that have not been studied. And I've tried to study that quite in depth for my own PhD. And I've seen that those logistic tasks, obviously they ask manpower to be done. And you find very frequently women doing those tasks, because this way you're not, probably, that's my understanding of it, using women for these tasks is to let the maximum number of fighters actually fight. Because if you use men to do logistics, then you have less people fighting. If you use women, then you can allocate all the men to the fighting tasks, and that's much more efficient. So it's very complementary. So you have women bringing material, you have women bringing food, bringing water, also bringing the moral support for fighters, which is something that is often disregarded in studies. The moral support is important for fighters, especially if the siege is lasting long. But yeah, so it is why at the beginning I was thinking about that in terms of gender difference. Are women doing things? Are men doing things? But instead, more and more, I begin to try to see that through another lens, which is active besieged and non-active besieged. So, for instance, non-active besieged, you have the elders, that can be men or women. You have the children as well. They're not active. They're not doing anything. They wait for defense, basically, because they are mouth to feed, and they don't do any task to help. And then you have the active populations, which are men and some women, not all of them, and not in every sieges. It's not always depicted. And that's why women is difficult to study in that regard, because in some occasion you see them performing logistic tasks, and in other you see them literally watching what's happened and not doing anything. So they're in a category in which you can't say women were doing this or women were not doing this, but you can say women were sometimes doing the logistics. And so it's a very difficult thing to look at that, because if you think about gender and say men were fighting, women were looking at what was happening, it's not true, because young men and old men were not fighting. If you look at women themselves, some were doing things, some were not. So the age is a much more interesting, in fact, lens. So basically, up to a certain age, probably 15, maybe 14, you had mainly inactive people. And then through adults, you had the most active population, those really being actors, and then the old ones were not doing anything either, or if they were doing something, it was more advising people. So saying you should do this, that happened in former operations, more really on the side of advice. But I think age is a much more interesting factor than gender to understand who was doing things. However, if you take gender, the main thing is women were doing necessary non-fighting task, and men were doing the fighting task, which was just as necessary. And so it's very complementary. So that's what was kind of interested in studying gender, just to see that everyone had something to do or not to do, but everyone had his role, basically.
What was the strategy used by crusaders when they besieged different towns and cities in the Levant?
So on that regards, probably just as a preliminary word, I need to define what sieges were, probably a bit more in depth, because every historian of the period has a different definition of what sieges were or were not. If we take the three definitions that are the most recent, so if we take Michael Fulton, he has the most restrictive definition of sieges, asking for what he would call an energetic defense, which is difficult to really define what it is. But he asked basically the garrison to have acted in a certain way for a certain time. So it's removing all the short operations. If you take Jan Wilson, which have the more open definition, then he's saying that every action against the fortified place is a siege. And more recently, so I've come to that field, and I think my definition is still a very open one, but not as open as Jan Wilson. So I've taken three categories basically to define what a siege was. So you have to get at least one of the three categories. So either you have a direct attack against the place, so an assault basically, or an attempt to assault the place, or you have a blockade of the place that can be either complete, full blockade around the city, or partial, just blockading some of the gates, for instance, reducing the ability of the besieged to move. And the third one is that the army stayed at least one day in front of a place before either lifting the siege, concluding a truce, negotiating a tribute, or obtaining the surrender of the place. So if an army arrived in front of a place, asked for the surrender, and the city surrenders straight, it's not a siege for me. It's not a siege for Michael Fulton either, but it would be a siege for Jan Wilson. If you take my definition, the army arrive in front of a place, wait at least a day, then obtain the surrender of the city, I consider that to be a siege. Jan Wilson as well, but Michael Fulton will not. So that's the sort of disclaimer I put. If you use basically Michael Fulton's definition, you obtain a bit less than 300 sieges for the period. If you use my definition, you have 717 sieges. And if you use Jan Wilson's definition, you get over 800 sieges. So that's just to show we do not agree on certain aspect of siege warfare because we don't define it the same way. So I'm just going to speak about my way to define sieges from here. So before speaking as well about strategy, just to introduce what sieges were. So there is a very widespread misconception about sieges being long operations that either ended by an assault or the surrender of the garrison because they were starving. And that is completely false, according to what I've been finding. So the main thing is, let's begin with food shortages and starving. Of the 717 sieges, I have 39 sieges that knew at least a temporary shortage of food. And among them, 18 lead to surrender, but only 13 are directly linked to the food shortage. So basically, you have 13 sieges of 717 that ended because the population was starving. So it's really exceptional. And for the rest, assaults, you have 132 assaults, but only 93 that were able to take the entire city, 40 that were able to take the city, but not the citadel. So if you look at that, we cannot say that surrender due to food shortage was a thing. It was so exceptional that you cannot define siege with that. And then we come to the second problem, which is thinking sieges were long operations, when in fact they were very short. So in my data, I've been able to obtain the duration or an approximate duration of sieges. Sieges lasting from 1 day to 10 days form 45% of the overall. So nearly half of all sieges lasted less than 10 days. And then if we add those lasting 11 to 45 days, then we reach 79% of all sieges. So 79% of all sieges were lasting less than a month and a half. So we cannot say long operation. And why we cannot say long operations is because if we look at the average campaign duration of the time, in Europe, a medieval knight had to serve between 30 and 45 days for a normal campaign. So sieges were clearly in that normal duration. And if we look at Muslim armies of the time, especially Turkish armies that were using a lot of Turkmen, they were rarely able to campaign for more than a few weeks. So a month and a half is the kind of limit in which they were campaigning usually. So sieges were completely of normal duration, even very short. If we take that, nearly half of them lasted less than 10 days. In fact, the average duration of sieges would probably be around 15 days, which is very low. And if we take sieges that lasted over a year, which tends to be what people think about sieges, lasting month or even year, it's less than 3%. So why was it so fast? So I've said the military service is part of the answer, but the main answer is that sieges are expensive and very uncertain operations. So basically what happened is that commanders arrived in front of a place, hoping either that the place would surrender very fast or that they would take it by surprise by making an assault, a very fast assault against the place. And if it's not happening, then commanders are asking themselves, is it worthing staying long in front of that fortified place? Because a castle does not deny you the ability to continue your campaign. You can ignore a castle. The garrison tends to be very small. They will not attack you. They will not destroy your army on the back, apart from major cities. Major cities are different. But for a simple castle, you can ignore them. Taking it will let you exploit the surrounding areas economically. So basically, it is a balance between how much that would cost me in lives or in money to take the place versus how much money I will win from exploiting the surroundings. It's not like modern conflict in which you use every possible resources to take place and to move the front forward. It's really about cost versus efficiency. And also, staying in front of a place for a longer time means that you have the risk of a relief force coming to attack you as well. And another risk is that, yes, the besieged will have to get enough food, but they tend to make reserves, and quite considerable reserves. Whereas your army arrive and have to find resources around the place you besiege. So if you're not in a harvesting season, you cannot stay long. If you're in a harvesting season, you might have ability to stay a bit longer. But overall, you have to resupply an army a maximum every 24 days. So you can stay 24 days without resupplying, maximum. So yeah, sieges cannot be long if you have to resupply a full army on an area that is quite poor. Then you're just not staying. You're going to the next castle, hoping to obtain something from it. And if it's not working, you move to the next one. And that's what happened in the full period. Two exceptions to that when the Crusaders arrived. So basically from 1097 to 1110, 1114, in which they tended to have to take the castles because they had to expand their lands to a sufficient size to survive. So they had to use all the resources they have to take places, especially ports, to communicate with Europe. And after the Battle of Hattin in 1187, because Saladin destroyed the Crusader army and relief force was no longer a danger, so he was able to split his army in multiple small armies to besiege different places at the same time without risking an army coming to attack them. So that's just the two exceptions. The very end of the period so I'm studying, so 1187 until 1189, so it's only 3 years. And let's say the first year of my period, so 1097 to 1110, 1114. But apart from them, it was very risky to take a place. And using that principle, besiegers were able to take the place in 62% of the cases. 62% of the sieges succeeded. So it's very interesting to see that by applying those cautious, they were able to limit the number of defeats, they were able to limit the duration and so the cost of sieges. So if we look about what a siege looks like, so the strategy itself, you arrive in front of a place, either you try to take it by surprise with an assault if you think the garrison is not prepared, or you try to negotiate their surrender. If they refuse, then you try to take the city, and to do this, or to force them to surrender, and to do this, you need to threaten them enough. And that can be done either by assaulting them, by mining the fortifications and trying to create a breach. People think that mining led to assaults. In fact, most mining led to a breach, and when the breach was done, the castle surrendered. They were not waiting for the assault because they knew it was lost. And they had better to give up the castle and save the people inside, save the weapon inside, and try to defend another place instead. So the basic sieges was about that, trying to force the enemy to surrender or taking it by assault. But to do that very quick. Obviously, people think about sieges like Antioch during the First Crusade or Acre during the Third Crusade because it's very exceptional sieges. And if you take those two sieges plus the siege of Jerusalem in 1099, during the First Crusade, you probably have half the writings in primary sources that only speak about those. So you have hundreds and hundreds of pages about Antioch. Same for Acre, same for Jerusalem. And sometimes you have 2 lines for a very minor siege, saying that, for instance, Zanki arrived in front of that place and took it by assault. That's all you know.
Yeah, we have
the
problem with the lack of primary resources. If you have to say something additional, maybe we can close for now, and I'm planning to invite you more in the future. This is just the initial conversation between us. Yes.
Yeah, well, if you want, we can always do another podcast more focusing on some aspect of siege warfare,
of course,
and go into more detail if you want.
Of course.
I might have to go quite soonish though. So maybe we can use the remaining time and then speaking for a few minutes together,
Yes, go
and
ahead.
then I'll have to go. So did you want to ask any other question about sieges?
What was the fate of besieged people in case the fortress fell, and was there any kind of fair play between two parties, or it's not the case?
Okay, so two cases. The first one is if the place surrender. If the place surrender, you make a treaty, and that treaty grants sort of life to people. What in Arabic they say the aman, and aman is really a good definition of what it was. You grant life for people, and then you have difference between treaties. Some allow people to stay in the place. Some ask for the people to exile to another area. Some allow them to take goods with them. Some just allow them to take their clothes and to leave. So you have different treaties, but in general, when a place surrender, lives are protected, and sometimes goods as well. If you take about assault, which I suppose was the main aspect of your question, when a city was taken by force,
yeah,
then it followed a sort of similar pattern since ancient Greece, until European 30 Years' War. So basically from very early antiquity until early modern history, basically, if the city decided to resist and was taken by assault, then the population could be slaughtered or enslaved. And that's the sort of norm of siege warfare. So it wasn't considered atrocious. It wasn't considered shocking. It was normal for people of that time. The main difference is about how much you can kill and how much you have to take prisoners. So basically, in the period, the norm was if the place was taken by assault, you could kill men of fighting age. You could kill them all. And then for women and children, you wouldn't kill them, you would enslave them. And then comes the question of elders, and it's difficult to say what really happened to them. They seems to have been spared and not taking as slave because they were economically worthless.
Yeah, they were users for the winning party, in a way.
Yeah. So so on that, basically, it tended to be well respected. Men were killed, women were and children were enslaved, and then elders, we don't really know what happened to them. Probably they just stayed in the city. So that's the norm. Obviously, the norm wasn't always respected. And that's when they were crossing the borders of what was acceptable or not. So if we take, for instance, the siege of Jerusalem, women and children were killed as well. So it was shocking in that regard for medieval writers, because women and children were also killed and not spared. However, it is not as well, it's not the worst massacre that happened in the period, because some were still taken in slavery or made prisoners, some were spared as well. It's not an entire massacre, but what made it probably more famous than the others is the symbolistic aspect of the city. It was the holy place of three religions.
Exactly.
So that a holy place was taken by killing a lot of people was shocking to writers. But if you take other sieges, for instance, in 1110, the siege of Beirut by the Franks, they completely respected the norm, and Ibn al-Qalanisti is writing about that event, and at no point in his story he is saying anything to say that was bad. He's basically saying people were enslaved, a governor's men were killed, and he has no single word that means shock or something like that. But he has with other operations. For instance, he's very shocked when Zonki is not respecting the treaty, the surrender treaty in Baalbek. So you had a few very bad massacres at the beginning of the period by the Franks. An explanation is because they didn't have the military power to watch over these population. They couldn't control them, so they killed them.
Yeah.
I'm not entirely satisfied by that explanation. I think it's part of it. And another part is the lack of discipline by men, especially by pilgrims. Because if you take examples of taking ports, yeah, they were basically making a treaty which wasn't respected by the pilgrims that decided to massacre, because they were here to do that.
Yeah. We'll continue. We'll continue about massacres and atrocities.
Yeah.
For now, we can close our conversation. Absolutely. For the time being, and I'm planning to invite you, and we can discuss in more detail about norms of besieging cities and norms of warfare in medieval times, particularly during Crusades. Thank you so much.
That sounds absolutely perfect.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was very nice.
Thank you for inviting me as well.
You'll be invited more in the future. I guarantee you.
Well, thank you.
Thank you so much. All the
best.
Pleasure.
All the best. See you later.
Bye-bye.
Bye.